Last thing we're going to talk about this week are some different terms that are commonly used for describing, for example, the location of organs in the body or location of injuries, for example, and also which describes some of the movements of the body, which we'll be using a lot when we describe how muscles work later on in AMP 201. When we talk about anatomical position in terms, there's a couple key things we need to know first. Right off the bat, when we are discussing left and right, you need to remember that left and right is always determined from the standpoint of the patient. So, in anatomical position, which is what this lady is in, an anatomical position, by the way, is feet slightly apart from one another, hands to the sides with the palms facing forward, head facing forward. In anatomical position, what you think of as being on the left side is actually the right, and what is right is left. That's because this is actually that patient's right hand, even though to you it looks like it's on the left side. Always, 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 when we use the terms left and when we use the terms right, from here on out, through all of the rest of this class and all of 201 and all of 202, we are referring to anatomical left and anatomical right. That means the left of the patient or the right side of the patient. Okay, let's talk about some of the anatomical terms and position terms that we need to know. First one is, you'll notice when this woman's in anatomical position that her palms are facing forward. When palms are facing forward, that's called supine. You can also be in a supine position if you lay on your back on the floor. That would mean your back is touching the floor and your stomach is facing towards the ceiling. That would be in a supine position. If you were in a prone position, you would be face down to the floor. Okay, so supine, prone. Easy way to remember this: put your hand out in front of you with your palm up facing towards the ceiling, and imagine that you have a bowl of soup that you're carrying in your hand, in the palm of your hand. Okay, you carry soup in the supine position. If you turned your hand over, you would be pouring the soup out. That's in the prone position. So I carry soup in the supine position, I pour it out in the prone position. Another set of terms that you should know are ventral and dorsal. I've mentioned these before already when we talked about body cavities. The dorsal body cavity, for example, contained the brain and the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity contained all of the other internal organs like the lungs and the stomach and the bladder, etc. Now in humans, ventral is really the same thing as anterior. And in humans, dorsal is really the same thing as posterior. But be careful. If you're talking about an organism with 4 legs on the ground instead of 2 like we humans, the terms anterior and posterior and ventral and dorsal are not interchangeable. So if we look, for example, at this picture of a dog, the anterior part of the dog is this way towards the head. The posterior part of the dog is this way towards the tail, but the ventral part of the dog is this way towards the belly, and the dorsal part of the dog is this way towards the back. Okay, just like you'd have the dorsal fin on a shark. So humans are unusual in that ventral and anterior can be used interchangeably, and dorsal and posterior can be used interchangeably, but with most other organisms that isn't the case. Now, anterior and posterior, we already kind of discussed this. Anterior is the front half of your body, posterior is the back side. In humans, that's the same thing as saying dorsal and ventral. But again, in 4-legged critters, anterior and posterior have a slightly different meaning towards the head or towards the tail. Superior and inferior. These terms are used to refer to what is farther away from the bottom and what is closer to the top. So superior means above, inferior means below. So this woman has a hat on superior to her head. Or you could say her head is inferior to her hat. You could also describe the position of things like her mouth. Her mouth is inferior to her nose. Or her eyes are superior to her mouth, for example. Medial and lateral. Imagine if you were to draw a line down the middle of a person to divide them into equal left and right hand sides. Anytime something is located closer to that midline, we say it is medial, or towards the middle. Anytime something is located farther away from the midline, comparatively speaking, it is lateral. So in this case, this person's ears are lateral to his nose, or his nose is medial to his ears, for example. Proximal and distal. Key here to remember with this: proximal and distal relate to arms and legs only. Okay, so you can say that this woman's shoulder is proximal to her hand. Okay, proximal means closer to the body, to where the arm or leg attaches to the body. Distal means farther away from attachment point. Okay, so the shoulder is proximal to the wrist. The feet are distal to the knees. The hips are proximal to the knees. Okay, you'll want to practice those, try a few out for yourself, make sure you understand how that goes. How about superficial and deep? Superficial and deep mean how close to the surface of the body something is, or how far away from the surface of the body it is. If something is very far away from the surface of the body, we say it is deep. For example, if I have 3 or 4 layers of muscle tissue, the layer of muscle tissue found farthest in or closest to the bone would be the deepest layer. The layer of muscle tissue closest to the skin would be the superficial layer of muscle tissue. Now, some other things to know about. There are some different types of what are called anatomical planes. These are imaginary lines that we can draw through the body to divide it into different regions. The first one I'm going to talk about is what's called the sagittal plane. And the sagittal plane is any plane that divides the body into left and right sides. If the division into left and right is exactly in half, so that you get a mirror image left and right, then you have drawn a line exactly down the middle of the person and you have a mid-sagittal plane. If instead you draw a line, this is a person here, and you draw a line down the person such that you get left and half sides, but they are not mirror images of each other, in other words the division is unequal, then you have a parasagittal line. A frontal plane is a plane that's drawn through the body, basically through the shoulders, as you can see here, and the idea here is to divide the body into an anterior and to a posterior, or you can say into a ventral and a dorsal plane. Lastly is a transverse plane, and in a transverse plane I am basically creating superior and inferior sections of the body. Okay, so I'm drawing a transverse plane through this lady's waist. That means there's a superior portion above that plane, there's an inferior portion below that plane. Now, we already talked about body cavities a little bit. I want to expand a little bit on them. You remember that there are 2 main body cavities. There's the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity, and that the dorsal body cavity is divided into 2 parts. The cranial cavity, which contains the brain and all of the other goodies that come with the brain, such as the meninges, which are a coating around the brain. And then there's the vertebral cavity, which includes the spinal cord, the vertebral column, or the vertebrae that surround the spinal cord, and all the other goodies like nerves that come with that. The ventral body cavity is more complex. You'll remember that it is indeed the diaphragm that divides the ventral body cavity from in 2, so that above it, superior to the diaphragm, you have the thoracic cavity. And in the thoracic cavity, if you were to draw a line down the middle of your sternum to divide, your left and right sides of your thorax, that line is called the mediastinum. Okay, and then of course below the diaphragm is where you have the abdominal cavity, and then at the margin of the hip bone below that point is of course the pelvic cavity. Now I mentioned very briefly that there was this covering or coating on the brain. That covering or coating is called the meninges, and it's a layer of 3 different types of connective tissue that cover both the brain and the spinal cord, and they're there for protection. I want to just mention it to you right now. Here's a picture of the part of the meninges reflected back so you can see the brain underneath, but they are there to protect the brain and spinal cord, so be familiar with the term meninges. There are also, and those meninges are what line the dorsal and ventral, the dorsal body cavity. So it lines both the cranial, let me go back here. It lines both the cranial part of the dorsal cavity and it lines the vertebral part of the dorsal cavity, all lined by the meninges. Now, if we were to look at what lines the ventral body cavities, we have a different type of tissue involved here. And the kind of membrane that lines the ventral body cavities are called serous membranes. Okay, and serous membranes do not have any opening to the outside. Instead, they coat organs. For example, we have a serous membrane that covers or coats the heart. We have another serous membrane that covers or coats the lungs, and we have another set of serous membranes that cover or coat most of the digestive organs, such as the intestines, the stomach, etc. All serous membranes have 2 layers. They have an outer, what's called parietal layer, and they have an inner, what is called visceral layer. And in between those 2 layers, there is a space filled with fluid, and that fluid is called serous fluid. Okay, why have that? Well, it really helps alleviate friction. Imagine, if you will, you have the heart, okay, like you have here. By having this double layer called the serous membrane surrounding the heart with a fluid in between the 2 layers, when the heart beats, it's moving and it's brushing and rubbing up against the lungs, it's rubbing up against the ribs, and that can create a lot of friction and can actually produce bruising if we didn't have some sort of lubricating mechanism in place to alleviate that friction. That's what that serous fluid is for, in between the inner visceral and outer parietal layers of the serous membrane. Similarly, we have a serous membrane covering the lungs, because the lungs move in and out as you inhale and exhale, and would also suffer from friction rub if we didn't have some way to lubricate. And in the abdominal pelvic cavity, we also have a type of serous membrane that helps coat those organs as they do a good bit of moving as well. Another function of the serous membranes is it compartmentalizes the organs. So let's say that you get a lung infection. Because the lungs are covered with that serous membrane, it makes it much more difficult for bacteria to spread from the lungs to other parts of the body. So we compartmentalize the organs. The serous membrane that coats the heart is called the pericardium. Peri means adjacent to, cardium means referring to heart. So the serous membrane surrounding the heart is the pericardium. The serous membranes surrounding the lungs are called the pleurae. Pleura is singular, pleurae is plural. And the serous membrane that coats the internal organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity, things like the small and large intestine, the stomach, etc., is called the peritoneum. Okay. Now, there's one other type of cavity we haven't talked about in the body, and those are the types of cavities that open up to the environment. So for example, you have a cavity that is your entire digestive system. Your mouth, your oral cavity leads to your esophagus, which is an opening that extends to the environment. That connects with your stomach, to your small and large intestine, etc., all the way to the anus. That is an open cavity in the body that is in essence exposed to the environment, and it is lined with a special kind of membrane to help protect it against infection from items it might come in contact with in the environment. And the type of membrane that lines cavities that open to the environment are called mucous membranes. Now, I've given you one example of all of the digestive tract. Another example you can think of from looking at this picture of a dog is the nasal passage. The nasal passage is also lined with mucosal membrane. Again, the purpose of this is to protect. When we secrete mucus, that mucus is fairly sticky stuff, and it does a pretty good job of trapping dust particles, bacteria, fungal spores, anything else that we might be either, say, inhaling in or eating in our food that might be damaging or potentially destructive to the body. We can trap with those mucous membranes. Okay, good enough for that topic, and I'll see you in class.